Welcome in, everybody. Let's dive deep into some notorious crimes and the criminals behind them. We've got some really interesting sources to work with today. Articles about big FBI cases, profiles of some infamous serial killers, even a Wikipedia list breaking down like all these terrifying figures.
Hmm.
It's pretty extensive.
Wow. Talk about an encyclopedia of the macabre. We've got it all right here.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, that these cases aren't just about catching the bad guys. They give us a look into how the FBI itself has changed over time, how they've had to, adapt their methods to take on some of the most complex and just disturbing crimes ever.
It is pretty fascinating stuff. So let's get started with some of those early FBI cases that really made the Bureau famous. Think back to the 1920s, the killers of the Flower Moon era. The Osage murders. That was the FBI's very first big homicide case.
Oh, yeah. This one's super interesting because it exposes this horrible conspiracy. So the Osage Nation had gotten wealthy from all the oil found on their land, and tragically that made them targets. At first, people thought the deaths were just accidents or suicides, but as more and more people died, the FBI stepped in, and their investigation uncovered this really systematic plot to just wipe out the Osage people and steal their wealth.
It's a story that's still relevant today, a reminder of just how dark greed can be. And speaking of cases that captivated the whole country, we can't forget the Lindbergh baby kidnapping.
Oh, absolutely. The kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's son back in 1932, it was a national tragedy. The FBI's involvement, although they didn't directly catch Bruno Hauptmann, the guy who ended up being convicted, did help shape how investigations were done for years to come.
Now, this next one takes us right into the Cold War, the Rosenberg espionage case.
Right. The FBI was using decoded Soviet cables as evidence, and they found a spy ring that had actually gotten into the U.S. atomic program at Los Alamos. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were accused of handing over atomic secrets to the Soviets. They were convicted and then executed in 1953.
A lot of people still debate this case today. Some say the evidence against the Rosenbergs wasn't strong enough, that it was more about the Cold War hysteria than actual proof. What do you think about that?
Well, it's complicated for sure. The case really highlights the struggle between national security and individual rights, a debate that we're still having today. What's clear is that the Rosenberg case reflects all the anxieties of the Cold War era, a time when the fear of communist infiltration was everywhere.
Speaking of dramatic cases,
Yeah.
who could forget Bonnie and Clyde? Their crime spree during the Great Depression, all those bank robberies and murders, made them folk heroes to some and public enemies to others.
Yeah. Their case is a great example of how the FBI worked with local police to track down criminals across state lines. The FBI started using early profiling techniques, looking at Bonnie and Clyde's patterns and behaviors to predict their next move. It all led to their dramatic end in a shootout.
People love to romanticize their story in movies and books, but the truth is their crimes were brutal and deadly. All right, let's shift gears now. Let's look at what the FBI was doing during the Civil Rights era and after. The murder of Medgar Evers in 1963. He was a really important civil rights activist. This case really highlights the ongoing struggle for justice.
The FBI's persistence in this case is amazing. It took over 30 years to finally convict Byron Della Beckwith. He was the white supremacist who killed Evers. This case exposes just how deep racism ran and the resistance to civil rights that plagued that whole era. The FBI had to navigate some really dangerous territory to bring a killer to justice.
It really shows their dedication, especially in such a racially charged time. And then there's the mystery that just keeps on giving. D.B. Cooper.
Ah, yeah. The man who hijacked a plane in 1971 got $200,000 and then parachuted into the night, never to be seen again, even after a massive search and tons of suspects. We still don't know who Cooper was or what happened to him.
I mean, it's like a case made for conspiracy theories.
Right.
What do you think is the most likely thing that happened based on what we know?
Honestly, it's really hard to say. There's just not enough solid evidence to know for sure. Did he survive the jump? Did he spend the money? These are the questions that keep people guessing. It's what makes D.B. Cooper almost like a mythical figure.
From a mystery that's never been solved to a case with so many twists and turns, the Patty Hearst kidnapping in 1974, a newspaper heiress kidnapped by a radical group, the Symbionese Liberation Army, and then she ends up joining them.
It's a story that had the whole country hooked. Instead of just being a victim, Hearst appeared to embrace her captors. She even took part in bank robberies. She was eventually caught and convicted. But her case still sparks debate about things like coercion, Stockholm Syndrome, and even the idea of free will.
Okay, time to take a deep breath here and enter some really dark territory, the world of serial killers. You've brought a whole list of these figures. It's almost like a who's who of horror. Where do we even begin?
Let's start with a name that everyone in Boston knows. Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler.
Oh, yeah. DeSalvo confessed to killing 13 women in Boston in the early 1960s, but some people still question if he actually did it. It's a case that's full of both fear and fascination. I actually saw that recent Hulu movie about DeSalvo. It honestly left me with more questions than answers.
It's interesting that you brought up the movie. It definitely got people talking about whether DeSalvo was really guilty again. But since he died in prison back in 1973, we may never know the truth.
It's almost like the mystery itself makes the whole thing even scarier. Okay, next up, we've got someone who takes creepy to a whole new level. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. A truly disturbing guy.
His way of doing things was chilling. Gacy would lure young men and boys to his house, often by pretending to offer them jobs. Then he would torture and kill them. He even buried a lot of the bodies in the crawl space under his house. Finding 29 bodies under his house in 1978 was a huge shock to the nation.
It's that contrast. Him being Pogo the Clown in public, but then the horrible truth of his crimes. It's what makes this case so unsettling. And then we have Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Can you imagine being on a lighthearted game show and having this horrible secret?
Alcala was a photographer. He often took pictures of his victims. They found hundreds of these photos when they arrested him. And the police think some of the women in those pictures might be other victims who they haven't identified yet.
That's the kind of thing that just gives you chills. It makes you wonder about all the photos we take today. Are we accidentally capturing future crimes?
Yeah. It's definitely a chilling thought. Alcala's case shows us that looks can be deceiving, how easily evil can hide behind what seems normal. It forces us to face a really uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't always look like how we think they should.
That's for sure. All right, next on the list, Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. BTK stands for Bind, Torture, Kill. That was his chilling signature.
He terrorized Wichita, Kansas for decades, sending these taunting letters to the police and the media. The case went cold for years, but in the end, it was his own arrogance that got him caught. In 2004, he started sending messages again. This time, he sent a floppy disk to the police. He thought they couldn't trace it. But that digital mistake is exactly what led to him being identified and arrested in 2005.
Talk about letting your ego get in the way of not getting caught.
Oh.
Get ready for this one. We're about to discuss one of the most notorious serial killers ever, Ted Bundy.
Oh, Ted Bundy. Practically the definition of a serial killer. Handsome and charming. He used that charm to lure young women to their deaths throughout the 1970s, often pretending to be hurt or needing help. His brutality and how he manipulated people are all well documented.
What I find really disturbing about Bundy is just how many people he killed.
Mm.
And the fact that he escaped from custody multiple times just adds to the horror. It's like he was playing with the authorities, enjoying how famous he was becoming.
Yeah. His case still fascinates and horrifies people. There are so many books and movies exploring his crimes and trying to figure out what drove him. But even with all that analysis, there's still a feeling of mystery around him, a darkness that we might never truly understand.
And last but not least, we have Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. His satanic symbols and those seemingly random acts of violence terrified Los Angeles in the mid-1980s.
Ramirez would break into homes, rape, rob, and murder people in their sleep. He was obsessed with the occult. He would leave satanic symbols at the crime scenes. It added this element of ritualistic terror to his crimes.
Even when he was being sentenced, he was defiant. He said, "See you in Disneyland." It's chilling and so unsettling. It's like a glimpse into his really disturbed mind. Wow, this deep dive into the lives and crimes of these people has been fascinating and, to be honest, a little overwhelming. I'm curious, what are the main things that set serial killers apart from other kinds of murderers?
While all murders are horrible, serial killing is defined by some very specific things. First, the number of victims. It's usually 3 or more. Second, there's a cooling off period between the murders. It could be days, weeks, even years. And finally, the reason behind the murders is mainly psychological. A really deep need for power, control, or even sexual gratification.
It's that psychological part that really makes them different, right? It's not just about the killing itself. It's about fulfilling this twisted need that most of us can't even imagine. Okay, let's go back to those chilling details we talked about for each killer. The things that really make your blood run cold. We'll start with Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler. Remember, there's still debate about whether he was guilty, but one detail that I always think about is that a lot of his victims were elderly women, found strangled in their own apartments.
Yeah, the fact that the victims were so vulnerable and the crime scenes were so personal definitely made the terror around DeSalvo's case even worse. It played on people's deepest fears, shattering the feeling of safety they had in their own homes.
And then John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. The thing that gets me is just how many victims there were. At least 33 young men and boys, most of them buried under his seemingly normal house in the suburbs. It's horrifying to think that evil can be hiding right in plain sight.
It's such a stark contrast. The image of a clown. You usually think of joy and laughter, and then the horrible reality of Gacy's crimes. It really shows how deceptive evil can be, how it can hide in the most ordinary things.
With Rodney Alcala, it's all those photographs he took of women and girls, many of them in suggestive poses. It haunts me. The police believe some of those photos might actually be of other victims who haven't been identified. It's a chilling thought. To think someone's picture could be taken so casually and then later become evidence in a murder investigation.
It speaks to a level of depravity and this need to document his crimes, maybe like trophies, or a way to keep reliving his fantasies long after he committed the act. It's disturbing to think about, but it does show how important it is to be aware of what's around us, to be aware of the potential dangers, even in situations that seem totally harmless.
Okay, now Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. What always gets me is how carefully he planned his attacks. He even drew diagrams of his victims' houses, the level of planning, and how deliberate his crimes were. It's truly unsettling.
Yeah. His case shows us just how much control some serial killers want, and the sick satisfaction they get from the planning process itself. It's a dark reflection of what humans are capable of, how meticulousness can be twisted into something horrific.
And Ted Bundy, the thing that always gets to me is how normal he seemed. So charming, even while he was doing these horrific things. It's a stark reminder that evil doesn't always look evil. It can be disguised as charisma and charm. His case really makes you rethink what you believe a killer looks and acts like.
Absolutely. It shows how dangerous it is to judge a book by its cover. Bundy's case teaches us that evil can have a friendly face, that manipulation can be subtle, and that even people who seem charming and trustworthy can have darkness inside them.
And finally, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. What always sticks with me are those satanic symbols he used, often drawn in blood, right at the crime scenes. It's like he was putting on a macabre show, using symbolism to make the fear and horror he was causing even worse.
It speaks to his desire to not just be violent, but to create a spectacle, to make people feel like there was something supernatural and uncontrollable happening. It adds a whole layer of psychological torture to his already brutal crimes, leaving a lasting impact on the victims and the entire community.
These details are a serious reminder that we're dealing with people who are deeply disturbed, driven by impulses that most of us can't even begin to understand. It's sobering, isn't it, to realize that this kind of darkness exists inside the human mind.
It really is. But it's also a reminder that understanding those impulses, studying the patterns and motivations of these people, is crucial to maybe preventing tragedies like this in the future. The more we learn, the better we'll be at recognizing the warning signs and stepping in before it's too late.
That's a hopeful thought. Even in all this darkness, we've covered some of the most well-known FBI cases and serial killers. But this is just the beginning. Your list of categorized serial killers makes me think there are many more chilling stories out there, some that I've never even heard of.
That's what makes this field so fascinating and sometimes so disturbing. There's always more to learn, more patterns to analyze, more to discover about the dark side of human nature.
The monster, the Mangones, the Stoneman, the Pillow Killer. Just the names themselves are scary. I'm both terrified and intrigued to learn more about them.
I get it. It's a natural reaction. These cases, as unsettling as they are, give us a glimpse into the complexities of the human mind, what drives evil, and the challenges of facing the darkest parts of ourselves, ready to keep exploring.
Let's take a deep breath and dive in. The more we understand, the better prepared we'll be to face the darkness.
You've got some really obscure names on this serial killer list, too. I think it's important to talk about them as well. Let's start with Karl Denke. He was a German killer from the early 1900s.
Oh yeah, the Cannibal of Zebes. That nickname alone is terrifying. What made his case stand out as particularly horrific?
Denke preyed on travelers and people who were just passing through. What makes his case so different is his meticulous record-keeping. He documented his victims in detail, even how he prepared and ate their flesh. It's a truly disturbing look into the mind of a cannibalistic killer.
It's a side of humanity most of us would rather not think about. But it's real. Okay, let's move on to Brazil. The case of Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito. His crimes were especially heinous.
De Brito targeted young boys. He subjected them to sexual abuse, mutilation, and ultimately murder. It's a case that really reminds us how vulnerable children are and the devastating effects of sexual predators. It shocked Brazil, leading to demands for stricter laws to protect children.
It's a reminder that evil can look like anyone. and those who prey on innocent children often hide in the shadows.
Okay.
This next one takes us to Cali, Colombia, back in the 1960s and 70s, the monster of the Mangones.
This one is really unsettling because they never definitively caught the killer or killers. They terrorized the city, kidnapping, torturing, and murdering young boys. Their bodies were found dumped in sugarcane fields. The fact that there's no known suspect makes it even more mysterious and unsettling.
It's like a real-life ghost story. The specter of violence haunting a community makes you wonder how many other monsters are out there, still hiding, waiting to be unmasked. Speaking of hauntings, the case of Milton Cipollo, the Lusaka Strangler, takes us to Zambia.
Right. Cipollo was a soldier. He targeted women and girls in Lusaka in the 1980s. He'd rape and murder them. Sadly, his case isn't unique. It shows a disturbing pattern, the abuse of power, especially by people in positions of authority. It's like a fundamental betrayal of trust.
It reminds us that evil can be lurking in the very places we expect to find safety. It makes you question who you can really trust. Okay, let's bring it a little closer to home. Well, Dominique, the Bayou Strangler.
Dominique preyed on men who were vulnerable, often homeless or struggling with addiction. This was in Louisiana from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. His case highlights a really tragic reality. Serial killers often go after people who are marginalized by society, people whose disappearances might not be noticed or investigated for a long time.
It's so sad to think that these victims were basically invisible to society, their lives seen as less important. It makes you realize how much we need more compassion and awareness, a system that values and protects everyone. Okay, let's go back in time to the early 1900s, the case of Bela Kiss. His story sounds like something out of a horror film.
Bela Kiss. He was a Hungarian killer. He targeted women he met through personal ads. He was never caught. He just disappeared right before the police found the bodies of his victims, preserved in these big metal drums on his property. We still don't know what happened to him.
Just vanished, leaving a trail of bodies behind. It's nightmare fuel. Makes you wonder, did he start a new life somewhere else? Or did he die a gruesome death himself? Let's move on to Joachim Kroll, the Ruhr cannibal. His crimes were brutal.
Kroll terrorized West Germany from the 1950s to the 1970s. His crimes were extremely violent and involved cannibalism. He often went after young children, dismembering their bodies and eating parts of their flesh. His attacks were so random. His victims ranged from 4 to 61 years old. It created this atmosphere of fear in the community.
Yeah, it's the unpredictability that makes it even scarier. The thought that anyone could be a target, no matter how old they are or their situation. Speaking of targeting specific groups, Arthur Shawcross, the Genesee River Killer. He focused on sex workers.
Shawcross was active in New York State during the 1970s and then again in 1989. Most of his victims were sex workers. He'd strangle and mutilate them, like a lot of the cases we've talked about. It shows the dangers faced by groups who are marginalized by society, people who are often overlooked or dismissed.
It's a sad reminder that everyone deserves justice, no matter what they do or their social status. And then there's Earl Nelson, the Gorilla Killer. His crimes were especially disturbing.
Earl Nelson. He was all over the U.S. and Canada in the 1920s. He was a necrophiliac. He would often target landladies, strangle them, and then have sex with their bodies after they were dead. It's a disturbing part of serial killer psychology. It shows a complete lack of empathy. The victims are just objects, even in death.
That's a truly horrific thought. Okay, so let's jump ahead to a more recent case. Robert Pickton, the pig farmer killer. His crimes shocked all of Canada.
Pickton went after women from Vancouver's downtown east side. It's an area known for poverty and drug use. He'd lure these women to his farm, kill them, and then get rid of their bodies by feeding them to his pigs. His case really exposed how vulnerable these marginalized communities were and the failures in the system that allowed him to keep doing this for so long.
It's a tragic story. It shows how much we need better social safety nets and support systems, especially for people who are living on the margins of society. Okay. Let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about some unsolved cases, mysteries that still baffle investigators and haunt everyone. You mentioned the Stoneman killings in India.
These murders happened in the 1980s. The victims were found bludgeoned to death with stones, their bodies left out in public. There's no suspect. And the sheer brutality of the crimes created this wave of fear. The Stoneman case is still a source of speculation and anxiety in India to this day.
It's unsettling to think that such a brutal killer could just disappear, leaving behind so many unanswered questions. Speaking of unsolved mysteries, you also included the Cleveland torso murderer.
This killer was never identified. They were active during the 1930s, targeting mainly homeless people. What makes this case so disturbing is the way the killer operated. He would dismember his victims, often decapitating them and taking their bodies apart, then scattering the remains in different places.
That level of brutality is hard to even imagine. It's like something out of a horror movie. And the fact that they never caught the killer just adds to the mystery and fear.
Yeah. It's a case that continues to fascinate and horrify people. It shows how powerful unsolved mysteries can be, how they capture our imaginations.
We've gone deep into some truly dark parts of human history today, exploring the lives and crimes of people who did unimaginable things. It's been a heavy journey, emotionally and psychologically. Where do we go from here?
It's really important to remember that even when faced with this much darkness, there's always hope. We can learn from these cases, we can study the patterns, and we can work towards a future where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to happen.
That's a good thought. It brings a bit of light into all this darkness. I'm curious, as we keep going through this list, are there any other themes or patterns you've noticed that we should be looking out for?
One thing that keeps coming up is how these killers target people who are already vulnerable. Like we've seen, they often go after people they see as weak or easy to get rid of, people who might disappear without anyone noticing right away.
Yeah, that's been a really sad pattern we've seen throughout this whole deep dive. Sex workers, homeless folks, runaways, people battling addiction. They're so often the victims of these predators. But their lives matter just as much, and their murders deserve the same level of investigation as any other crime.
Exactly. Every victim deserves justice, no matter their situation. Understanding this pattern of targeting vulnerable people is crucial if we want to prevent these things from happening.
It makes you realize how important it is to be aware of what's going on around you, to be able to spot those red flags, and to speak up if something doesn't feel right. We all have a part to play in keeping our communities safe, especially protecting those who are most at risk.
That's a really important point. Community awareness and a sense of responsibility are key. You also made an interesting distinction in your list. You separated serial killers who acted alone from those who worked in groups or pairs.
It's something I find fascinating and really creepy at the same time. The idea that some of these people might have been influenced or encouraged by others, that their crimes were the result of some shared darkness rather than just one person's obsession, it adds a whole other level of complexity.
I know, right? It makes you wonder about how influence works in these relationships, the power dynamics. Would they have become killers if they hadn't met their partner in crime? It makes us think about how social interactions play a role in criminal behavior.
It's a scary thought, but an important one. As we're wrapping up our deep dive into these cases, I can't help but wonder, how has our understanding of these criminal minds changed since these crimes happened? And how about investigative techniques? Have those changed too?
That's a key question. Forensic science has come a long way, especially with DNA analysis. That's completely changed how we identify suspects and solve old cases.
It's amazing to think about how many cases have been solved because of DNA evidence. Evidence that just didn't exist a few decades ago. It's a powerful tool for getting justice.
It really is. And beyond the science, our understanding of criminal psychology has gotten much better, too. We're much better at recognizing patterns, motivations, and the things that might make someone more likely to commit these kinds of crimes.
So it's like we've learned from all this darkness, haven't we? In a way, these horrific cases have helped us understand criminal behavior better, and we've come up with more effective ways to prevent it and intervene.
That's a great way to put it. By studying the past, by really facing these dark parts of human history, we're giving ourselves the tools to create a safer future.
It's like a glimmer of hope, even amidst all this darkness. But as we've seen, there are still mysteries out there, unsolved cases that still haunt us. The Cleveland torso murderer, Bella Kiss. Their stories remind us that the pursuit of justice, the search for answers, it never really ends.
And maybe that's the most unsettling thing, but also the most motivating thing about all of this, the quest for understanding, the fight against evil. It's a journey that might not have a clear end, but it's a journey we have to keep taking.
It's a journey that takes courage, compassion, and this unwavering belief that knowledge can shine a light on even the darkest parts of humanity.
So as we close out this deep dive, I want you to think about what we've talked about today. How has what we know about criminal behavior changed since these cases? And how can we use what we've learned to prevent these things from happening, to intervene, and to pursue justice?
And if you're feeling curious, I urge you to dig deeper into the cases that really stuck with you. Research the names that sent shivers down your spine. Remember, even in the darkest parts of history, there are always lessons to be learned, stories waiting to be uncovered, and maybe even a glimmer of hope to be found.